My name is Michael Wood. Since the age of 17, I've been willing to die in service to my community. In the U.S. Marine Corps, I was Sergeant Wood.
Michael Wood spent 11 years in the Baltimore Police Department.
Michael Wood is a very honest individual. He was not liked by the Baltimore City Police because he didn't play the good old boy network game.
As my career developed, I set out to understand why people offend, instead of how they offend.
The reason why these consent decrees don't do anything is because there's no enforcement or changing of the mechanism of incentives for the officers. So all you're doing is talking about it.
I certainly was going to cross. I was ready to shoot if I had to, but I was never going to cross that line.
But you kind of wanted to shoot.
Sure. Get what you inspect, not what you expect.
So, or anywhere that's populated, is your metric is based off of arrest. So you don't actually go out and engage with the community, because that would be time that you could be getting the arrest that you're expected to get to prove that you're a decent officer. So you actually don't have any incentive to communicate.
Michael, we should be looking for goals to not have people end up in the criminal justice system. Instead, every solution we have is to push them into the criminal justice system.
It should not be up to Jeff Sessions to determine how Baltimore Police Department operates. It should be up to the residents of Baltimore. Jeff Sessions doesn't know anything about policing, never has and never will.
I want to read a quote that you gave the Washington Post, which struck me. You said, "When you work in policing, you're inundated early on with the us versus them mentality. It's ingrained in you that this is a war, and if someone isn't wearing a uniform, they're the enemy. It just becomes part of who you are, of how you do your job."
What I'm trying to say is that we are looking at people who are doing nothing new, and if we focus on the actions, then we can fix the things for next time. Because when you focus on people, we end up thinking we can chop the head off, they put a new person in and something will change. But if we don't focus on the methodologies and the institutions, then we will be
put them in a prison cell, do the paperwork, go back out and do it again. So what we really need is to change the incentives and disincentives so that no matter what the role, we're still going towards that objective that actually serves.
More occupation, more vehicles, if your answer continues to be violent, because we have to understand that everything about policing is inherently violent. I have come in there with authority and told you what you will do.
So in a previous episode, we were discussing the article that I wrote along with some other assistants, that the NFL is called "The NFL is not unpatriotic or racist," but is essentially the encapsulation that the NFL is unpatriotic and racist. And one of those big highlights that we were discussing is the brain injuries that occur to NFL players and how it's very much a system of exploitation and supremacy to get onto mostly poor people, to have physical damage done to them, to be exploited with some very intangible hope of becoming stable and becoming more of a part of the American dream, so to say. And that correlation to traumatic brain injury and PTSD was by far my biggest awakening with what happened during the Standing Rock actions of Veterans Stand for Standing Rock. And that's in December of 2016, when me and some veterans led up 2,000, 4,000 veterans to Standing Rock, North Dakota, to protest the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline running through tribal lands and having environmental issues, brutalizing citizens. So most people should know that issue. But when I got there and I was around 2,000, 4,000 veterans for the first time in my life, really, because even though I was a Marine, I was in an anti-terrorism unit. I was in a very small unit, and I was kind of isolated from the rest of the military. And this is the first time I saw the military as a whole. And this was a high-stress environment where people were looking to come to a fight. We ended up in the middle of a blizzard where a lot of actions had to be done to fight to rescue people out of the blizzard. And that triggered and that set in a lot of what wartime environment was like. And then you can see it. I feel like to even talk about it feels like you're kind of talking down, but it's like you're watching a movie and you can see that 1,000-yard stare. You look around and they're not all there with you. And these are our veterans. These are men, women, old, young. There was people there from Vietnam to the actions in the Middle East that we have now most recently. And this damage was widespread among all of those members. It felt like at least 50% of the people there had that stare where they had been traumatized and they could not come back to what this was. And I don't think their biology is set for this anymore, because we have permanently damaged them and pushed them out of our society, where they probably are a threat to us. Not threat to us, it sounds like a stupid way of saying it, but a threat to the safety and civility we have at home, because this just compromises our morality. It puts people in a situation where they can be more violent, where we shouldn't be doing fireworks on the 4th of July because of what we could be doing to our neighbors. And it's like our answer again is to stop doing the fireworks. And it's like, fuck, this is not a conversation about not using fireworks. This is a conversation about not traumatizing people, that you fucking manipulate them into going overseas to kill brown people for the profits of fucking private and global industries. This is what we're doing, and we have to stop that stuff, because it seems bad when you look at it from a I don't know, like a point outside of the actual action. And that's where I was. But when I was in it, around those vets, it was like, shit, what are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the blank stare. Can you speak about some of the other symptoms or behaviors that you saw manifested as a result of all this?
Yeah, so the biggest one that really, I guess because it was the stress of the environment that was going on and how many people were involved, but there's this easy inclination that everyone is the enemy and no one can be trusted. And to a certain extent, that was true. That's true. I mean, that's not, maybe that's a conscious awakening, and I'm saying that they have that stare that maybe we should be having because of that mind being blown, that they've gone through this thing where they thought they were serving their country. They thought they were doing good. And then you get into the battle and the things that happen, and you realize that you don't know who to trust, because the bottom line is that freaking 18-year-old kid in Afghanistan, he's not any different than you. And as we get more information going in the forward, I think we know that more. We hear the damage that we're doing, and then it does, even in a logical standpoint, set in this idea of no one can be trusted. Everyone's going to try and harm us and be our enemy. It doesn't matter what they say to us. And that's like, you can't get people to work together because they're not trusting what's happening, or they want to prepare for a fight that I don't think is real. Like a lot of reports came out from Tiger Swan, which is a private security company, infiltrating the Standing Rock movement, which they did. And if you're a part of any large protest and you are not expecting that a significant portion of those people will be infiltrators, you have not been paying attention and probably shouldn't be leading any kind of actions, because of course they're going to be there. But when you have people that have injuries for the TBI and are set in this different post-traumatic stress mindset, they don't see infiltrators as infiltrators. They see them as mercenaries and as somebody that's willing to take their life that must be fought. And we're not in a war. We are in a protest. We are dealing with other American citizens. We are here for a bigger cause. This isn't going to be this isn't a war, but it's so easy to go back into things being a war. Very much like it's easy that people can see who criticize me, that I can go into police mode real fucking fast. It's been ingrained in me as a result of our society overall. So I don't want people in policing to either think, well, how do we make somebody like Mike Wood reintegrate into society and speak to us in these pleasant tones that we wish he would? It's like, no, how about you don't send 17-year-old children off to become killers for those oil profits and killing brown people overseas, and then send them into a job where you do the exact same things in the streets of Baltimore. Like, that's what we have to stop doing. We will not look at where we're starting these issues.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out is important for anyone who cares about policy generally, And, a piece I wrote for StayUp.News recently touches on this. It was titled, "If You're Poor and Black in Baltimore, Help Isn't Coming on the Limits of Policy or on the Limits of Politics." But, in America, we tend to do everything but address the actual issue we're trying to address, right? So like you said, we don't find a solution that eliminates PTSD, such as not sending people off to war, which we know they're going to come back with PTSD. We try to not trigger that PTSD by eliminating fireworks on the 4th, right? Which is...
Yeah, I call it the friendly fascism.
Yeah.
That's what we want.
And we do this with all manner of policy, right? Like there's a policy with respect to homelessness that is known as Housing First, and it essentially says, to eliminate chronic homelessness, you give people homes, and regardless of what they do, you let them stay in that home. You don't require that they get services or other help. And it has shown to drastically reduce chronic homelessness. But the model that is generally in play in the United States is this continuum of care model, where if you're a homeless person, you have to sort of like go through these different levels of treatment and services until you've essentially proven that you can now be in a home full time. And it's at that point that folks attempt to get you stable housing. But of course, the lack of stable housing throughout that process makes it almost completely impossible that you would ever actually sort of progress and have success in those different services and treatment options. But, more problematically, the policy doesn't address homelessness, and instead it tries to essentially achieve a theological aim, which is to save the individual through these treatments and services. And then when you get baptized and you're ready to re-enter the community, you can have a home now. And so rather than address the issue, which is homelessness, so obviously the solution is give them a home, we do everything but that and say this is how we're going to fight homelessness. And this is a real problem in the way that we address these issues in the American context.
That is super, another one of those good points where it's us. It is us. And we so have to recognize that this is the American system that we're putting into a myriad of different subjects. That if you probably look at this angle for most subjects, I think you'll find something. And when you're talking about the homeless issue, I guess it's such a dumb thing to say. I guess it is a homelessness issue that we established. Being in LA now, dude, there is not a neighborhood that I can get to in any reasonable amount of time where the home values on average aren't less than $800,000.
That's just crazy.
How do you, I don't care if you're homeless and you have all the resources in the world, but if you've been subject to the conditions that push you into homeless, other than the few people that choose it, and the people that do choose it, I think they're also a reflection on our society that they're like, dude, I'd rather just be segregated from the shit that y'all guys have built. But even if you could take somebody at their 25 years old, 30, 40 years old, how do you get them to a point where they could live in a place that has $800,000 home value averages?
No, I mean, that's exactly it. And a lot of persons who have dealt with chronic homelessness, if they didn't have mental health issues before they became homeless, they definitely have mental health issues after they've had to live that way for some period of time. And so, we're essentially demanding that people who are at sort of their most vulnerable and at their least capable jump through all these hoops before we're even really willing to mitigate the challenges that they're going through.
I mean, this shit feels so gross in it being everywhere we look. Even when that past article that we were talking about with the NFL and the way that they treat the veterans, one of the things in there is the nostalgia effect that the NFL has put into the presentation of the very pro-veteran concept.
Yeah.
And I want to picture us how it has these transcending effects into different areas. When the homeless person feels like they've been lied to their whole life and they've been given this bad deal. So many of us feel like we've been given this bad deal, but we're allowing it to happen right in front of us. For instance, like these paid patriotic things where the NFL is actually paid to sit there and do the flyovers, to do the military ceremonies, to come out there, and we're criticizing Colin Kaepernick about not standing for a pledge that, or not the pledge, but the national anthem, and all this paid for patrioticness where it feels like, yes, look at our hometown heroes, look at our troops. But what we're really, in effect, doing is we are spending millions and millions and millions of taxpayer dollars from oppressed classes to feed the misinformation that there is something honorable about going and getting PTSD and having 476,000 veterans in 2011 being diagnosed with PTSD. 476,000 in 2011. But our view of the military is, and the NFL together, is this gross, oh, look, you can do this. You will be a hero, and you will not be a hero. You will be a fucking victim.
Yeah, and I think the point that we discussed and that you brought up in the previous episode about the NFL, which is the fact that, the NFL, and it's obviously not the only most professional sports, but the NFL certainly recruits a lot of its players out of poor communities. And the military then pays the NFL all sorts of money to put on these patriotic displays because it also recruits most of its people out of poor communities, right? Because for many,
these athletes are the ones they can't get.
Yeah, and so exactly, right? Like those guys are just too skilled. But we're latching on to a brand that is already popular because for many poor people, it represents a path out of that. And so they're both sort of coming together to convince poor people to go live a life of getting traumatic brain injuries in the hopes that will break the cycle of poverty for their family. Meanwhile, that traumatic brain injury almost, and that, the continual traumatic brain injuries that one will suffer in both activities, almost guarantees that even if you obtain a large measure of wealth, one, you're going to spend a lot of it on your healthcare. Two, you're going to struggle to manage it because your capacities have been reduced by these injuries. And how many times have we seen an athlete who was like once on top of the world and then they just lose everything and you're not exactly sure how it happened? And there's a lot of things that I think factor into that phenomenon, but one of them certainly is the fact that we take these people and then obliterate their minds.
And let's not pretend that it's a complete lie. Neither, though. Like you will. So these athletes, the idea of sport from poor people to get athletes, some of them will succeed, and you will see those stories. And
Definitely.
Right. And that's what happened to me. So the military, like I come from extreme poverty, and now I do live in a neighborhood that has $700,000 average home values. And part of that is because I did a sport. But my sport was not the NFL. My sport was killing. And that did break me out of poverty. They did give me a college, let me go to college. They did give me those tools to break out. But I struggle just like many of the athletes did, in that I don't have the physical damage, but I have the emotional damage and the idea that I have to get into the literature and explain these things and talk about all this stuff so other people don't fall into these same damn traps of becoming this.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, and I obviously never played in the NFL and I did not serve in the military, but I have friends who did. And, I want to honor their sacrifice because I do think that the reality of the world we live in today is that nations are going to be at war from time to time, and their sacrifice and their willingness to go volunteer and be part of this force meant that persons like me don't have to share that sacrifice, right? Once upon a time, military service was a much more shared sacrifice than it is today. And today it's almost exclusively the provenance of the poor. But, as much as I want to honor them, I also don't want friends of mine going away for a few years to a foreign country and then coming back and never being able to reestablish their lives because of the trauma that they experienced. And even
in the Veterans for Standing Rock thing, like those are the ones I think were mostly TBIs. Like that was the extreme measure that we saw. And those are the guys that have combat history and are most likely the ones that are like, yeah, let's go out there, we can handle this, let's stand up to these police. So I think we were dealing with the more physical TBI injuries. But we have to remember also in the military that it's 9-to-1 support. So even when we say, we give most veterans like this concept and this praise for thinking that they went and fought. But the vast majority of military members don't fight. They kind of do something way more sinister, where they offer support. So it's like you pressed a button on the Predator drone. You didn't pull the trigger. We pulled the trigger in combat arms. But I think that when you're working in admin even, and you are writing those bullets out, you're sending those bullets out to the Marine Corps to use. When the Marines use them and you see the effect of that, you have this, they're not the ones that are going to go out there, but that's affecting people far beyond the post-traumatic stress. That's a weight that people are bearing on them once they understand even these nonviolent actions, which they've done.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point.
That's us watching the NFL.
No, yeah. I just, for our audience, anyone who's interested about this issue of PTSD and the question of whether it's more of a physiological issue than a psychological issue, there was an article that came out last year in June of 2016 in the New York Times. It's titled, "What if PTSD is more physical than psychological?" I recommend folks read that article because it goes into a lot of both the history of brain trauma and the way it's been treated at different periods in military history. But I think it presents this argument for understanding the issues and PTSD specifically that our soldiers come back home with in terms of the impact of warfare on the brain.
Yeah, I mean, and so we've also discussed that one of my more controversial positions that maybe we can get into one day, but I think that just makes everybody say that this guy is crazy, that all violent crime is biological, and maybe all of it's biological. There is no separation between the brain and the body. That is a ridiculous concept that came from who knows what.
Oh, I can tell you where it came from.
Okay, go ahead, tell me that. I would love that.
So in the West, in our history, that's a basic Platonic proposition, right? In the Platonic system, which Christianity broadly adopted and sort of carried forward throughout history, you divide the human animal into two distinct parts, the soul and the body. The soul houses the rational mind, and it is the mind that is the faculty that allows us to obtain knowledge and specifically truth. And so because the mind has been treated as a psychological phenomenon, psyche being the Greek word for soul, we treat the mind and issues related to the mind or behavior or thinking as though they're not tied to our body. And in the Platonic system, the material and physical world is always just a pale reflection of eternal or immortal truths. And so the real human being is housed in that immaterial, invisible soul that houses the mind. The body is just a temporary shell. And as a result of that, and Christianity largely adopting that and carrying it throughout our history into our present, that being the sort of principal intellectual tradition in which all of our countries here in the West have swum in for the last couple of thousand years, we still are conditioned to think about the mind as something distinct from the body. But there is no right scientific discovery that says, oh, here's where the soul is, right? That's just this philosophical proposition that Plato, more than anybody, has articulated back in 400 BCE. And we're still essentially committed to that, at least discursively. And, I'm sure you, as somebody who has been in the military and in the police and have probably done a lot of different workouts and things, there's that whole mind over body idea that we tell ourselves, you got to push hard and, you got to control your body with the mind and all this and that. And we're still committed discursively to this strict separation between mind and body. But everything that we think goes through the brain. It's purely a physiological phenomenon. We're just not conditioned to thinking about it. So we don't think about our behaviors as a consequence of physical processes. We think about our behaviors as a consequences of decisions made in the rational soul. And because of that, we can't deal with issues like PTSD. You know, we demand people get therapy when, you know, what they might need is well beyond just something you can handle by talking it out.
So with how these conversations that we can get into just feel super weird, but it's very hopeful, I think, on looking at reality. So these pathways that we can go down to that are super hard for people to accept is that I'm ultimately a postmodernist. I think that we are products of conditions and experiences that happen to us. So we are given a DNA plate to begin with from the very beginning, and then we will have our experiences throughout life, and that formulates who we are. So it doesn't matter if you're Saddam Hussein. If you have that DNA plate from the beginning and you have those experiences, you would become Saddam Hussein. There is no separation. So when you go to something like counseling and you want to treat an issue with counseling, all you are doing is adding an experience into that soup. You're not actually thinking about what the real issues are. So it can be helpful, but it is not the actual issue. Whenever something happens to somebody and they're going through something that's bringing them down, for instance, that is a chemical, that is hormones, that is the way the biology of the body is interacting. Everything is biological. So the traumatic brain injury issue is biological. That is a damage which changed that DNA plate that you were given. And I had a lot of damages to the experience plate. Right? So you can be in the NFL and not have all those experiences in life that would give you post-traumatic stress. You could have the physical damage of your DNA plate, or it can be experiences, because these things are not separate. They're all interwoven, holistic ideas of who we are. And if we separate ourselves as mind and body, as Christian and soul, we are completely missing reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the challenge that our society has moving forward is being able to sort of extricate itself from propositions that maybe in terms of the knowledge base that existed in 400 BCE made sense, but today do not. And we cannot remain committed to attempting to resolve the issues we have in our society on the basis of ideas that no longer have any validity whatsoever.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to go down a bad rabbit hole, but I think maybe us having these conversations do help in us maybe breaking out of that paradigm. And it will just be a super slow paradigm of us getting out. And I think, to me, I just want to be like, why can't everybody look at this as an algebra equation? Now, if you have a variable on the left side and you have a variable on the right side, you knock that variable out. Who cares? Throw it away. Isolate what is really happening to us. And to do that, we're going to end up having moral imperatives. And maybe that's part of the scare, is if we do say, look, the NFL, maybe the NFL isn't evil. Maybe football isn't evil. I don't know. But what it does to human beings is not something we can come up with an algebra equation to fix. It's not something to mitigate. It's something to stop doing. Very much in the way that with the veterans, that it is not about discussing how Veterans for Standing Rock went, how those people got to there. Sometimes we don't even need the history lesson. We need to just say, stop.
This has been another episode of Nuance, a production of On Background Media Incorporated for StayUp.News. Intro and outro music provided by Baltimore's God Sense Beats. If you are a regular listener, please consider supporting our work, which you can do for as little as $1 a month. Simply go to patreon.com/StayUpNews, StayUpNews, all one word, and select your monthly donation and reward tier. Again, that is patreon.com/StayUpNews. On behalf of myself and Michael Wood Jr., thank you again for listening.